It began not with thunder, but with silence. A silence so heavy it pressed against the marble walls of the mansion and echoed through the empty corridors like a ghost. In that silence sat a man who once believed he was untouchable, a billionaire whose empire stretched across continents, whose name made markets tremble. Yet tonight, he trembled instead. He sat alone in the grand hall, hands covering his face, his breath uneven. His wealth had bought him everything but peace, and tonight even the machines he had worshipped refused to obey him. The crown jewel of his fortune, a jet designed to surpass all others, lay broken, mocking him with its refusal to fly. He had summoned the brightest engineers, the most celebrated minds. They had all failed. And now, the man who owned the sky could not even command one machine to rise. That was when he whispered it, the kind of sound man makes when the weight of his own life finally collapses on him. A cry, low and raw, slipping past the cracks of arrogance he had spent a lifetime building. He thought no one would hear it. After all, who could possibly be near enough to notice the sound of a titan breaking? But someone did. Beyond the gates, curled against the cold stone wall, a beggar stirred. His body was thin, his clothes ragged, but his ears had learned to notice everything. The shuffle of steps, the clink of coins, the sigh of doors closing. Tonight, he heard something different, a sob from a palace. He lifted his head, curiosity piercing through exhaustion. He rose, drawn not by hunger this time, but by the unmistakable sound of despair. When the guards saw him approach, they laughed, their torches casting long shadows across his hollow frame. "Back to your corner, old man. You don't belong here." But the beggar did not flinch. His voice was steady, almost calm. I heard him cry, "Let me in." Their laughter deepened, cruel and sharp. The master of this house doesn't cry. He commands. He conquers. He owns the night itself. Whatever you think you heard, it was not him. The beggar's eyes held theirs without blinking. Even kings cry when the walls close in. And tonight he is no king. There was something unsettling about the certainty in his tone. Against their better judgment, the guards hesitated. The air itself seemed to shift, the silence of the mansion pressing heavier than before. Finally, with a mixture of mockery and unease, they shoved him forward. "Go then. If you're not thrown out within a minute, we'll drag you out ourselves." The beggar walked into the mansion, his bare feet soundless against polished stone. The vast hall stretched before him, gilded with wealth yet empty of life. At its center sat the billionaire, his face buried in his hands, unaware that his solitude had been pierced. The beggar stopped a few steps away, his voice breaking the silence with the gentleness of a whisper, yet the weight of truth. "I can correct it." The billionaire jerked his head up, his eyes blazing with fury and disbelief. A ragged stranger stood where his pride should have stood. The absurdity of it struck him like an insult. "What did you say?" The beggar did not bow, did not stammer. His words were simple, sharp, impossible to ignore. "Your machine, your despair, both are misaligned, but I can correct it." The billionaire laughed, but it was the laughter of a man cornered, brittle, and bitter. "You? A man who owns nothing dares to speak to me of correction? Do you have any idea who I am?" The beggar's reply was soft, almost pitying. "A man with everything, except the one thing he needs most." The words hung in the air, heavier than the silence that came before. And for the first time, the billionaire did not know whether to rage or to listen. When we strip away the surface of glittering wealth and undeniable brilliance, the man at the center of this story, Leonard Carter, reveals himself as someone far more complex than the stereotype of the cold-hearted billionaire. Born into privilege, Leonard inherited not only his father's sprawling aviation empire, but also a relentless pressure to outdo every competitor and leave his own mark on the industry. For years, he succeeded. He was known as the Sky King, the man whose private fleet of jets dwarfed those of celebrities, royalty, and oil magnates. His reputation rested on precision, power, and perfection, qualities that demanded every machine under his command be flawless. Yet behind a polished smile at gala events and a commanding presence in boardrooms, Leonard carried shadows. He had climbed to the top of an empire, yes, but at the cost of building walls around himself. Friends whispered that he had no confidants, No one he trusted beyond the small circle of engineers who maintained his machines. Relationships were fleeting, conversations were transactional, and even among family, Leonard often seemed more like a distant figure than a father or brother. His jets were his companions, and in them he saw control over a world that often felt unpredictable. This is what made the sudden failure of his crown jewel so devastating. The Falcon X prototype, a gleaming symbol of next-generation aviation, was unlike any other jet in the world. It was designed with experimental technology, engines that could burn cleaner and fly faster, materials that seemed to defy physics, and systems that responded as if alive. For Leonard, the Falcon X wasn't just a toy for the rich. It was his legacy, the machine that would cement his name in history. And then it failed. Not a simple breakdown, but a catastrophic engine malfunction that rendered the aircraft useless. His team of elite engineers, flown in from across continents, worked day and night. They checked every sensor, every microchip, every fuel line, every line of code. Each time they believed they had discovered the root cause, another fault emerged. Leonard poured millions into the repair attempts, refusing to accept the possibility that this marvel could become a monument to failure. But as weeks turned into months, the whispers grew louder. Perhaps the Falcon X was too ambitious, too experimental, doomed from the start. This was not merely a technical crisis. It was a personal humiliation. The billionaire who prided himself on control was suddenly powerless. For the first time in decades, Leonard confronted a machine he could not bend to his will. The Falcon X sat grounded in a private hangar, covered in tarps, as though it were a corpse waiting for burial. At this stage of the story, we must pause and ask, why does this matter to anyone beyond Leonard himself? After all, billionaires suffer mechanical problems like anyone else, though theirs are wrapped in titanium and carbon fiber. But the answer lies in what happened next, and in the person fate placed in Leonard's path. Because the unraveling of his empire over a single jet created a vacuum, and into that space stepped someone no one could predict it. She had no title, no credentials, no degree stamped by a prestigious university. She had no polished shoes or expensive suits, no army of assistants or glossy magazine features praising her achievements. She was, in the eyes of most, invisible, a woman surviving on the margins of society, fighting daily battles that Leonard, with his wealth, had never even imagined. Yet within her mind lived a way of seeing machines that was unlike anything his engineers possessed. She understood engines not just as blueprints and algorithms, but as living organisms with quirks and rhythms that reveal themselves only to those willing to listen. The irony here is impossible to ignore. Leonard Carter had the world's brightest experts at his beck and call. He could summon entire teams of specialists with a single phone call. He could purchase the most advanced diagnostic tools money could buy. Yet all that brilliance failed. The answer to his billion-dollar problem would not come from the labs of Zurich or the research facilities of Silicon Valley. It would come from the sharp, intuitive mind of someone whom society often crossed the street to avoid. But before we arrive at that extraordinary collision of lives, it is important to dwell on Leonard's despair. This is the point where his arrogance began to crack, where the man who had built an empire on certainty started to question the very foundations of his identity. For nights he sat alone in the hangar, staring at the silent Falcon X, pouring himself drinks he barely touched. Those who saw him during this time reported that his voice, once booming with confidence, had softened into a whisper. The Sky King seemed suddenly earthbound. And here lies the dramatic pivot. Stories like this grip us not because of engines or technology, but because of what they reveal about human vulnerability. The jet was a symbol, yes, but it was also a mirror. It reflected Leonard's own fragility back at him, forcing him to face truths he had long buried. That he was not invincible. That money and power, while formidable, could not conquer everything. And most importantly, that sometimes the answers we seek come from places we least expect. The stage was set for an encounter that would shatter assumptions, not only Leonard's, but ours as well. Because when a woman at the margins crossed paths with the billionaire in crisis, the story transformed from one of despair into one of redemption, resilience, and a reminder of the extraordinary potential hidden within those whom society overlooks. On a damp October morning, When the hangar doors groaned open to let in the weak sunlight, the person who would change everything for Leonard Carter entered quietly, almost unnoticed. Her name was Aisha. She carried no badge, no invitation, no uniform that marked her as part of the engineering team. Instead, she moved with the tentative steps of someone used to being told she didn't belong. The security guards, distracted and weary from weeks of endless watch shifts, barely glanced at her. To them, she was just another face drifting near the edge of the billionaire's empire. Aisha had been living in the shadows of this world for years. Homelessness was not a choice, but the result of a storm of circumstances. A layoff from the factory where she once assembled turbine parts, the slow erosion of savings, and a landlord's final eviction notice. She carried her life in a worn backpack and slept wherever the city left her space. To survive, she picked up odd jobs, repairing bicycles, rewiring broken radios, patching up old lawnmowers. She was the kind of person most walked past without seeing, yet within her burned a quiet fire, an obsession with machines. Her love for engines had begun in childhood, when she would dismantle her grandfather's toolshed equipment, just to understand how the pieces fit together. By the time she was a teenager, she could take apart a motorcycle engine blindfolded and put it back together faster than most mechanics. But opportunities were scarce for a young black woman with no connections in aerospace, and life had pushed her talents into the margins. Still, wherever she wandered, Aisha carried with her an intimate knowledge of how machines breathed. On that October morning, she had drifted near the private airfield, drawn by rumor. Word had spread through service workers and night shift staff that the billionaire's pride, the Falcon X, was broken. For Aisha, this was not gossip. It was a calling. Something in her told her she needed to see it, not out of greed or curiosity, but out of the instinct that she might understand what others could not. Inside the hangar, Leonard stood with his engineers. The mood was tense, brittle. Weeks of failure had turned even the most confident specialist defensive. Charts and data sheets littered the tables. Screens flashed endless streams of diagnostic code. But no solution emerged. Leonard's patience was fraying. His voice, usually controlled and precise, carried an edge of bitterness as he asked once again why none of his experts could solve the problem. That was when Aisha spoke. Her voice was soft but steady. "You're looking the wrong place." The room froze. Heads turned toward her, eyes narrowing in disbelief. Who was this woman? How had she gotten past security? Her clothes were plain, her shoes scuffed, her backpack frayed at the seams. She looked nothing like an engineer. Yet there she stood, her gaze fixed on the silent aircraft as though she were listening to it breathe. Leonard bristled. Who let her in here? His tone was sharp, defensive. The humiliation of weeks of failure made him quick to lash out. This is not a spectacle. Get her out. But Aisha didn't flinch. She took a step closer to the jet, her eyes scanning its body with the practiced gaze of someone who had studied machines not from textbooks, but from lived experience. It's not the fuel lines, she continued calmly. Not the ignition system either. You've tested those too many times. The problem is in the harmonics. The engine isn't failing. It's fighting itself. The engineer scoffed. One muttered something about nonsense from a street wanderer. Another shook his head, exasperated. But Leonard, despite himself, hesitated. There was something in her voice, something precise and unyielding. For weeks he had been surrounded by men and women who offered him theories, charts, and excuses. This stranger offered conviction. He studied her for a moment, torn between pride and desperation. Finally, he gestured toward the jet. Fine, enlighten us. Show me what all these experts have missed. Aisha approached the Falcon X slowly, almost reverently. To her, the machine was not a lifeless hunk of metal. It was a puzzle, a story written in steel and circuitry. She pressed her palm lightly against the fuselage, listening. Then she crouched near the engine intake, tracing invisible patterns in the air. Her fingers hovered as though sensing vibrations others could not feel. She explained as she moved. Engines like this, they're more than fuel and fire. They sing. If the balance is off, even slightly, the vibrations compound until the system tears itself apart. It's like a choir where one voice is just a half note too high. The whole harmony collapses. Your diagnostics can't hear it because they're designed for numbers. But the machine doesn't speak in numbers. It speaks in rhythm. The room fell silent. Even the skeptical engineers found themselves leaning closer. There was poetry in her explanation, but also clarity. She spoke not as a dreamer, but as someone who had spent her life listening to the music of machines. Leonard crossed his arms, his face unreadable. "And what would you suggest?" Aisha pulled a small wrench from her backpack, the same tool she had used to repair bicycles and lawnmowers. She asked for permission, though her tone carried the confidence of someone who knew she wouldn't need it. "Let me open the casing. I'll show you." Against his better judgment, Leonard nodded. Perhaps it was desperation, or perhaps a flicker of curiosity sparked within him. The engineers protested, warning of liability, contamination, security risks. But Leonard silenced them with a single look. "Let her work," he said. Aisha moved with precision. Within minutes, she had loosened the casing and exposed a section of the engine no one had thought to check. She pointed to a coupling buried deep within the structure, a piece so small it seemed insignificant. "Here," she said simply. "This part is resonating out of sync. It's amplifying vibration across the system. You've been chasing the effects, not the cause." She adjusted the component with careful hands, aligning it with the intuition of someone who understood balance not as a calculation, but as a feel. Then she stepped back. "Try it now." The engineers exchanged skeptical glances, but Leonard gave the order. The systems roared to life. For the first time in months, the Falcon X engine purred with a smoothness that sent shivers down Leonard's spine. The vibration was gone. The impossible problem had been solved by a woman with no credentials, no lab, no resources. Only an unshakable connection to the soul of machines. The hangar erupted in stunned silence, then murmurs of disbelief. Some engineers whispered excuses. She got lucky. It was a fluke. But Leonard knew better. He had watched her hands, listened to her words. This was not luck. This was mastery. For a moment, he said nothing. He simply looked at Aisha, a woman who by all appearances had nothing, and realized she possessed something far rarer than wealth or status: vision. The encounter marked a turning point, the spark that transformed the story from despair into revelation. A billionaire who had everything but answers and a woman who had nothing but insight had collided in a way that neither could have predicted. And though Leonard didn't yet understand the full magnitude of what had just unfolded, he felt something stir inside him, a sense that this moment was bigger than a machine. It was about people, about value, about where genius truly resides. Leonard Carter had spent his entire life building fortresses. Fortresses of steel, of glass, of contracts and lawyers, of wealth piled high enough to shield him from ever being questioned. Inside those fortresses, every voice bent to his command, every head nodded, every solution was purchased, packaged, and presented. But now, for the first time, he found himself staring at someone who owed him nothing, who feared him not at all, and who had just succeeded where his empire had failed. It unsettled him. The hangar was still vibrating with the memory of the engine's perfect roar. The engineers stood off to the side, their silence thick with humiliation. Leonard's gaze moved from the Falcon X to Aisha, who was calmly wiping grease from her hand with a rag she pulled from her backpack, as though she had just finished fixing an old bicycle in the street. There was no arrogance in her demeanor, no gloating, just quiet certainty. Leonard spoke first, his voice low, laced with suspicion. "Who are you, really?" Aisha looked up, unflinching. "No one you bothered to remember." The answer stung more than he expected. He was a man used to people clawing for his attention, desperate to be acknowledged, desperate to be remembered. Yet here was someone who dismissed his question as irrelevant. She continued before he could speak again. "But I know machines. I know when they're sick. And I know when they can sing again." Her words hit him with the simplicity of a hammer. No equations, no theories, no walls of jargon. Just truth, delivered without apology. The engineers couldn't stand it. One of them, a man whose resume stretched across 3 aerospace giants, finally exploded. "This is absurd, Mr. Carter. You cannot possibly trust the opinion of some street mechanic. What she did was reckless. A system like that could fail catastrophically if tampered with by unqualified hands." Leonard turned sharply toward him. "And yet," he said coldly. Her unqualified hands just did what yours could not. Did I pay you for excuses or for results? The man faltered, his face flushing with shame. The others avoided Leonard's glare. None dared to challenge him further. Aisha slung her backpack over her shoulder as if preparing to leave. Your machine will hold now, but if you keep ignoring its voice, it will fail again. Next time may be worse. Wait! Leonard's command stopped her mid-step. His pride and his desperation wrestled within him. He wanted to dismiss her, to reclaim his dominance in the room. But the image of the Falcon X purring perfectly after months of torment would not leave his mind. You can't just walk away. Aisha met his eyes. Why not? You have your army of engineers. You have all the resources you'll ever need. You don't need me. Leonard almost laughed at the irony of it. All the wealth in the world. Yet in this moment, he needed nothing more than he needed her. And she knew it. That knowledge, that imbalance of power, left him both angry and intrigued. He took a step closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. Everyone in this room is terrified of disappointing me. They tell me what I want to hear. You don't. Do you even understand how rare that is? Aisha's expression softened for just a flicker of a moment. Then she shook her head. I don't care about what you want to hear. I care about what's true. Machines don't lie. People do. The statement pierced deeper than Leonard expected. Machines don't lie. How many times in his life had he been betrayed by people? Business partners who smiled while plotting against him. Family members who loved his money more than his presence. So-called friends who vanished when the deal soured. And here stood a woman who had nothing, no wealth, no protection, no social standing, and yet spoke with the unshakable honesty of steel. Still, his pride was not ready to bow. He straightened, his voice tightening. So what is it you want? Money? A job? Recognition? Everyone wants something from me. Aisha's answer came swift and sharp. I want none of that. What I want you cannot buy. Leonard blinked, caught off guard. And what would that be? Her gaze did not waver. Dignity. A place in this world that doesn't vanish when I close my eyes at night. The chance to be seen not as a problem to be removed, but as a person who matters. Can your money give me that? The word slammed into the air, heavier than any accusation. The engineers shifted uncomfortably, unwilling to meet her eyes. Leonard's jaw tightened. For once, he had no immediate retort. He had always believed money solved everything, if not through generosity, then through control. Yet here was proof of the one truth he hated most. Money cannot manufacture respect, nor erase the sting of being invisible. A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Leonard exhaled. Stay. Help me finish what we started. Not for me, but for the machine. If what you say is true, it's not fixed. It's only corrected for now. I want it perfected. Aisha hesitated, studying him. You don't trust me, and I don't trust you. That's no foundation for working together. Leonard allowed a bitter smile. Then perhaps we'll discover if mistrust is stronger than failure. The tension between them was palpable, a fragile bridge of necessity stretching over an abyss of differences. Around them, the hangar seemed to breathe, the Falcon X gleaming in the filtered light, a silent witness to a partnership neither had asked for but both now needed. As the day wore on, Aisha moved to the aircraft with hands that knew where to look, while Leonard hovered, torn between fascination and suspicion. He asked questions, sometimes curious, sometimes sharp-edged, and she answered with precision, never sugarcoating, never flattering. For the first time in years, he was not surrounded by sycophants, but by someone who saw him not as a billionaire, not as a symbol, but as a man with flaws and blind spots. And for the first time, Leonard Carter realized that perhaps his fortress was not as impenetrable as he had believed. Perhaps cracks had always been there, waiting for someone like Aisha to walk through them, not with force, but with truth. What neither of them knew was that beyond the hangar walls, forces were watching. Men who had bet fortunes on Leonard's failure, competitors who thrived on his weakness, and even allies who preferred him broken rather than whole. The arrival of Aisha and the resurrection of the Falcon X had already begun to ripple outward. The storm was not over. It was only beginning. The Falcon X had roared back to life, and for a fleeting moment, it felt as though the impossible had been conquered. But the higher a man climbs, the sharper the knives that wait in the shadows. Leonard Carter had enemies, not just in business, but within his own empire. Men and women who fed on his failures, who longed for his downfall. And when the rumor spread that his crippled masterpiece had been resurrected, those knives began to move. It started subtly, a misplaced tool, a log entry altered in the maintenance files, a sensor wire that Aisha swore she had checked twice, suddenly registering false data. At first, Leonard dismissed it as oversight, the kind of error born from exhausted staff. But Aisha's instincts screamed otherwise. Machines did not lie. Patterns did not break on their own. Someone was tampering. She confronted Leonard late one night in the hangar. The cavernous space was quiet except for the hum of cooling systems. The aircraft loomed above them, silent and perfect, yet beneath its skin, danger coiled. "Someone doesn't want this jet to fly," she said firmly. Leonard frowned, irritation flashing in his eyes. "Conspiracies? I've built my fortune on facts, not whispers." Aisha shook her head. "This isn't paranoia. I've lived too long on the edge to miss the signs. Sabotage has fingerprints. Tiny inconsistencies, like someone trying to make the machine look like it's failing naturally. But it's too neat, too staged." Her certainty unsettled him. He wanted to dismiss her words, but deep down he knew she was right. His empire was riddled with vultures. He had seen it in boardrooms, in shareholder meetings, in the way allies smiled with their mouths while their eyes stayed cold. If his Falcon X could not fly, his rivals would seize the moment to tear him apart. The next day confirmed her fears. During a routine systems test, the jet shuddered violently, alarms blaring. Engineers scrambled, shouting diagnostics, while Leonard's heart nearly stopped. Aisha dove into the chaos, her hands moving faster than anyone else's, isolating the fault in seconds. A severed wire, deliberately cut and hidden beneath a panel. Not wear, not error. A knife had been here. When she held up the damaged wire, the hangar fell into silence. Even Leonard could not deny the truth any longer. Someone inside his circle had betrayed him, but the twist cut deeper than betrayal alone. The next evening, as Aisha was leaving the compound, two men in tailored suits intercepted her near the gates. Their smiles were sharp, their tone casual but laced with threat. "You've done something remarkable," one of them said smoothly. "You've made the machine sing again. But you're playing a game far larger than you understand." Aisha kept walking, her grip tightening on her backpack straps. But they followed, their words slicing through night. "You think Carter sees you as an equal? He doesn't. To him, you're a tool, same as the wrench in your hand. Tools are discarded when they're no longer useful. But us, we could give you more. Money, a place, security. Walk away from him, and this city will remember your name." Aisha stopped, turning slowly to face them. Her eyes burned with quiet defiance. "I don't want your money. I don't want to be remembered for selling my hands to liars." The taller of the two men smirked. "Then you'll be forgotten with him. Both of you crushed when the Falcon X never takes flight." They vanished into the darkness, leaving her with the echo of a choice she never asked to make. Walk away and save herself, or stay in the orbit of a man who might never see her as more than a tool, but whose machine and whose life she had already begun to change. The following day, Leonard noticed something different in Aisha. She moved through the hangar with the same precision, the same fire, but there was steel in her eyes now, a guardedness. He confronted her in his brusque way. "You're hiding something. What is it?" Aisha hesitated, then met his gaze. "Your enemies approach me. They want me gone. They think if I walk away, the Falcon X will fail. They're not wrong." For the first time in years, Leonard felt a chill crawl up his spine. He realized he was not just fighting mechanical failure, but a war betrayal. And now, the woman he had almost dismissed as a nobody stood at the center of it. The machine was no longer just a machine. It was a battlefield where wealth, betrayal, and survival collided. And the question that hung between Leonard and Aisha was no longer, can the Falcon X fly? But can we trust each other long enough to survive what's coming? The hangar no longer felt like a sanctuary of machines. It felt like a war zone disguised in steel and silence. Every test of the Falcon X now carried the weight of suspicion. Every wire, every circuit, every bolt could conceal another hand of betrayal. Leonard Carter, a man who had once believed he ruled unchallenged, now found himself glancing over his shoulder in his own kingdom. And the unsettling truth was this: the only person he trusted even slightly was the one woman he had nearly dismissed on sight. Aisha. She worked tirelessly, sleeping in brief stretches on a cot tucked behind the tool racks, rising before dawn to crawl back inside the guts of the aircraft. Leonard would often find her with smudges of grease on her cheek, her hair pulled back, her eyes sharpened by focus. She never asked for comfort, never demanded recognition. She simply listened to the machine and bent her will to its whispers. But now her task was larger than repair. She had become both mechanic and sentinel, guarding the Falcon X against hands that would see it destroyed. The next strike came 3 nights later. A late shift systems run was sabotaged mid-test. Fuel ratios suddenly spiked beyond tolerance. The jet coughed violently, its control boards flashing red. Engineers panicked, scattering like startled birds. But Aisha didn't flinch. She threw herself into the controls, shutting down the fuel feed just seconds before fire could rip through the chamber. Leonard watched, breath caught, as she saved the machine with instinct so sharp it felt like sorcery. When silence finally returned, the hangar reeked of scorched fuel. The billionaire's voice cut through the smoke. They're inside. Someone on my payroll is feeding my destruction. Aisha turned, meeting his eyes. Then stop thinking like a king who owns everything. Start thinking like a man who could lose it all. Trust the wrong one and it's over. The words hit harder than she realized. Leonard Carter had built his empire on the assumption that loyalty could be purchased. He had never considered that betrayal could be bought just as easily. And now, the fortress of wealth around him felt more like a cage with cracks spreading wide. That night, he called a closed meeting. The engineers assembled under the harsh glare of fluorescent lights, their faces a mixture of fatigue and unease. Leonard's voice was sharper than a blade. "There's a traitor among you," he declared. "The Falcon X has been sabotaged twice under watch. My patience is gone. Whoever thinks they can break me will learn what it means to make me bleed." Uneasy murmurs filled the room. Some swore their innocence. Others stared at the floor, avoiding his gaze. Aisha stood in the back, watching silently. She knew anger alone wouldn't reveal the truth. Betrayal had a way of hiding in the quietest corners. When the meeting ended, Leonard found her waiting near the aircraft. "You think my fury is wasted," he said, almost accusingly. She didn't deny it. "Anger is fire. It burns bright, but it blinds. You don't need fire now. You need clarity." He narrowed his eyes. "And what do you suggest? That I let them walk free until they strike again?" Her reply was steady. "No. You let them believe they've won. You set the stage. Then you listen. Because saboteurs are like broken couplings. They reveal themselves when the system is under strain." Her strategy was unorthodox, risky. But Leonard felt something stir in him. A realization that this woman, with nothing to her name, understood war better than he did. She had survived on the streets, lived with predators circling her every day. To her, survival was not a theory. It was muscle memory. For the first time, Leonard let her take lead. Together, they staged a test run the following evening, deliberately leaving one panel unsecured, a small vulnerability that would tempt the saboteur into action. Leonard watched in the shadows as Aisha worked, her hands moving with the calm confidence of someone who trusted her own plan more than she trusted the world around her. Hours passed. The hangar grew still. Then, near midnight movement, a figure in coveralls slipped toward the Falcon X, glancing over her shoulder, unaware of eyes watching. With quiet precision, the figure reached inside the panel and pulled a wire cutter from their belt. Leonard's pulse thundered in his ears. Rage coiled in his chest, demanding release. But Aisha's hand on his arm held him steady. "Wait," she whispered. "Catch them in the act. Then they can't twist the story." The cutter's blades closed on the wire, and that was when Leonard stepped forward, his voice booming like a gunshot. "Stop. The saboteur froze. The wire dangled half-severed. The proof of betrayal laid bare. Security surged forward, seizing the figure. Under the harsh light, the traitor's face was revealed. One of Leonard's most trusted senior engineers, a man who had been at his side for a decade. The revelation hit Leonard like a physical blow. He staggered back, disbelief flooding him. "You," he whispered. "Why?" The engineer spat bitterly. "Because your empire destroys everything it touches. You think you own the sky, but you've crushed men like me under your heel for years. I wanted to watch you fall." The words carved deep, cutting into old wounds Leonard had buried. For the first time, he saw his empire through another's eyes, not as a monument of brilliance, but as a machine that had ground down lives in its pursuit of power. Security dragged the man away. Silence fell heavy in the hangar. Leonard stood rooted, his pride shattered, his certainty gone. And then, Aisha's voice, quiet but unyielding. "You built a world where no one tells you the truth. Now you've heard it, and it burns. The question is, what will you do with it?" For a long time, Leonard didn't answer. He simply stared at the Falcon X, gleaming in the artificial light, and realized the machine had become more than steel. It was a mirror, reflecting not just his ambition, but his flaws, his blindness, and now his chance at redemption. The saboteur had been caught, but the war wasn't over. The Falcon X was still a wounded bird, and Leonard's soul was still a man chained by arrogance. And the only person who could lead him out of the fire was the woman he had once dismissed as nothing. Together, they stood in the silence of the hangar, knowing the true test had not yet come. It would arrive soon, and when it did, it would demand more than machines. It would demand humanity. The night wrapped itself around the airstrip like a velvet curtain. The repair jet gleamed beneath the hangar lights, its engines humming with steady pulse that seemed almost alive, almost triumphant. Technicians stood nearby in stunned silence, their faces etched with disbelief at what they had just witnessed. For hours they had pored over schematics, plugged in diagnostics, run endless simulations, yet failed. And here was a man without a home, a man society called beggar, doing what billions of dollars and the best trained minds could not. The scene itself was surreal, but what lingered was not the sound of the engine, nor the glow of the lights, but the shift in the billionaire's eyes. They no longer carried the heavy glaze of arrogance. They flickered with something long forgotten, humility. He walked toward the man slowly, as though each step was a question. He looked at the beggar's hands, still blackened with oil, trembling not from fear, but from exhaustion and the weight of what he had done. For a moment, neither spoke. The engine roared softly, filling the silence, reminding them both of the strange miracle that had unfolded. Then the billionaire's voice broke, not booming as before, not commanding, but quiet, trembling, almost childlike. He asked, "Why did you help me?" "You owed me nothing. You didn't even know me." The beggar lifted his tired face. In his eyes, there was no triumph, no superiority. Only the steady calm of a man who had lived through storms no engine could match. He said simply, "Because sometimes life breaks in ways money cannot fix. I saw the way you sat on the floor, head in your hands. That wasn't a billionaire I saw. It was just a man in pain. I knew that pain, and I corrected it. The machine, yes, but maybe you, too." The words hung in the air, heavier than gold, sharper than any blade. The billionaire blinked rapidly, as though fighting back tears. For decades he had bought loyalty, manufactured respect, built empires of glass and steel to shield himself from the world. Yet none of it had prepared him for the raw power of those words. He felt exposed, cracked open in ways boardrooms and battles for profit had never managed. And in that vulnerability, he felt something almost foreign, gratitude. He reached into his jacket, instinctively pulling out his wallet, but the beggar raised a grease-stained hand, shaking his head firmly. "No," he said, "don't cheapen this moment with bills. You can't pay for what just happened. If you want to honor it, live differently. Hear more, see more, be more." His voice didn't rise, but it carried more weight than any contract, any corporate deal. It was not a demand, it was a gift, a reminder that correction was not just about engines, but about people. And so the billionaire did not offer money. Instead, he bowed his head slightly, a gesture so small, yet to those who knew him, it was seismic. It was the first bow he had given not to power, not to politics, not to prestige, but to wisdom in its purest form. That bow was worth more than any check. Later that night, as the jet lifted into the dark sky, its engines carrying the promise of journeys yet to come, the billionaire looked out the window, down at the shrinking airstrip, where a lone figure walked into the shadows. No cameras, no applause, no recognition. Just a man disappearing back into a world that had ignored him, forgotten him, yet needed him desperately. The billionaire whispered to himself, "Machines break, but men can be corrected too." He carried those words like fire in his chest. In the days that followed, whispers spread through boardrooms and business circles. People noticed something different. He no longer barked orders with venom. He listened more. He paused before speaking. He asked questions he had never thought to ask before. When someone called him sir, he corrected them softly. "Just call me by my name." It seemed insignificant, but it was seismic. The man who once thought power came only from wealth was learning that power, real power, was in humility, in listening, in being corrected. And though no one else knew the full story, though they had only seen the headlines about a jet that nearly failed and miraculously took off again, the billionaire knew. And deep inside, he carried not just a sound an engine roaring back to life, but the voice of a man who had once been invisible, now unforgettable. The world might forget the beggar's name. The streets might swallow his footsteps again. But the correction he made that night was not just mechanical, it was eternal. The beggar corrected a machine. The machine corrected a billionaire. And perhaps, if the story spread far enough, the billionaire would correct the world.